Justinian began his rule in 527 AD. He worked hard to govern his country from day to night. He made it his duty to restore the heyday of the Roman Empire, to try and revive its former glory. He reorganized and revised the Roman laws and wrote the Civil Law Encyclopedia, and achieved the high standard of martial prowess prominent in the whole history of Europe. However, just as he swept across North Africa, conquered Italy, and was about to regain the glory of the Roman Empire, a plague of unprecedented scale came unexpectedly, so that the dream of the Roman Empire's rebirth was popped like a bubble. From 541 to 542 AD, the plague began to erupt in Egypt in the territory of the Byzantine Empire, and then quickly spread to the capital, Constantinople, and other regions. It was the first large-scale outbreak and epidemic of plague in human history. Its climax lasted for 4 months, and Constantinople suddenly became a human purgatory. Because the epidemic occurred during the Justinian's reign of the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantine historian, Procopius, called it the Justinian plague. At first, there were only slightly more dead than usual, which did not attract people's attention. However, with the rapid increase in the number of deaths, it quickly developed to 5,000 to 7,000 deaths per day, and even reached more than 10,000 in a single day, making the burial of corpses a major problem. Every city then dug large pits to bury the dead. Constantinople, before the outbreak of the plague, was the most prosperous international metropolis at that time. But after the outbreak, all funeral habits and etiquette were left behind. No more elegies could be heard in the city, and no line of funerals to be seen. The streets were deserted, showing the severity of the plague. The number of deaths quickly exceeded 230,000, and there were not enough burial sites. The dead bodies piled up like mountains, and the whole city exuded the smell of corpses. Due to the influx of corpses and huge body piles, an awful stench emerged. To solve the odor, Justinian had dozens of huge pits dug in the Golden Horn area. In order to save space, all of the corpses were stacked together. Each pit was said to be able to bury about 70,000 bodies. 40% of Constantinople's population died amidst the plague in just a few months. Thus, Constantinople, a city famous all over the world, suddenly became a daunting city of the dead. According to Procopius records, after being infected, healthy people would suddenly catch a low fever, and would be beset by hallucinations, like seeing the devil, seeing ghosts. Their skin color would not change, and there would be no inflammation anywhere, but the long-term low fever made people weaker and weaker, causing them to lose energy. On the day of onset or the day after, the patient's groin, armpit, lateral ears, and lymph nodes at the thigh began to swell. The subsequent development of the condition varied from person to person. Some people had symptoms of lethargy, and others went insane. Patients who were lethargic had difficulty eating. In the absence of care, their nutritional deficiencies led them to death. On the other hand, patients with mental disorders could not sleep at all. They had hallucinations of the end, manic reactions, rolled on the floor or bed, screamed in the streets, self-mutilated, committed suicide, or died of hunger strikes. Procopius records, at that time, there were many strange and horrible scenes. When people were talking to each other, they would start shaking involuntarily, and then fall to the ground. When people bought things, they stood there talking or counting change unnaturally long. Death would also happen unexpectedly, which was the second symptom of the epidemic. In the third phase of the epidemic, the swollen lymph nodes of the patient began to die and rot away, and the patient suffered from unbearable pain. Some people also had other symptoms. Some experienced boils growing in the lymph nodes, and some patients had lentils grow on their bodies. Black pustules, which can cause death in a short time, are also appeared on the victims' bodies. In addition, patients with other symptoms had a chance of surviving. The earliest people infected with the plague were the poor people who slept on the street, who then gradually spread it to the noble class. It is worth mentioning that even the emperor, Justinian, who was far removed from the plague's epicenter, was unfortunately infected. But, after a period of rest, he recovered miraculously and continued to govern until his death in 565 AD. Prescopius recorded in his book, War Records, that this major plague came from Central Africa and first occurred near Pelusium, Egypt, spreading along two routes, with one spreading along the Nile River to Alexandria. As for the other parts of Egypt, the second route spread the plague to Palestine along the edge of Egypt, and then to Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and was spread by the army and by caravans to the rest of the world through two routes, land and water. This ruthless plague ravaged Rome's land repeatedly, and it broke out 5 times again after the first outbreak. From 547 to 548 AD, it was disease-carrying animals that caused the plague, and the livestock industry was fatally hit. Looking at it considering its many recurrences, the Justinian plague has characteristics of seasonality, selectivity, high infection rate and high mortality. The plague claimed a total of 25-50 million lives in Europe. It lasted 225 years, which was more than 2 centuries, and finally disappeared in 750 AD. The occurrence of the Great Plague has brought more disasters and effects to the Byzantine Empire than the plagues that occurred in Athens and Anthony. In terms of the number of deaths, a city in Constantinople was wiped out for the first time, with tens of thousands of people, nearly 1/3 of the entire Eastern Roman Empire, having lost their lives, resulting in a death rate of roughly 33%. Before the outbreak of the plague, the population of the Byzantine Empire should have been more than 26 million, but after the first plague broke out, Prescopius claimed that half of the empire's population had been wiped out. The deaths of such a large number of young and middle-aged people in the country ended up depleting the army's troops, and the border defense of the Byzantine Empire was weakened heavily. In his later years, Justinian could hardly find anyone in the country who was well enough to fill out the nation's dwindling military. Before the plague, Justinian had an army of 650,000. By the time of his death in 565 AD, his army at the eastern border was less than 150,000. The plague had greatly shook the Byzantine Empire for thousands of years and became one of the important reasons for the decline of the late Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was a country dominated by agriculture. The Great Plague caused a large number of population and livestock deaths, which caused a serious shortage of agricultural labor, leading to famine. The Great Plague also caused other industries to be hit hard. All industries became sluggish and inflation occurred. This resulted in decline, financial difficulties, and the need to reduce the salaries of doctors and other public officials. The suspension of all entertainment venues in Constantinople further exacerbated the plight of the citizens. In short, post-disaster famine, inflation, and huge tax burdens continued, causing resentment throughout the society, affecting people's normal order of life, and seriously affecting the social stability of the entire empire. The epidemic greatly weakened the national power of the Roman Empire, allowing the Arabs to conquer large areas of land on the southern coast of the Mediterranean without much effort. These brutal blows shattered Justinian's ambition to revive Rome, and his dream was completely broken. In 559 AD, the Bulgarian leader delved straight into the empire's territory and arrived in Constantinople. After the death of Justinian, the western territory was quickly lost and the Byzantine Empire gradually declined. The Great Justinian Plague had a profound impact on the historical development of the Byzantine Empire, the Mediterranean and Europe.
Today's video is finished. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, please subscribe to the channel. Goodbye.